In this video, I'm going to walk you through some of the different types of track in minimal orchestral and how you can use them to quickly and easily add atmosphere to a game scene. So what I want to do is I want to add some music to this scene, the Sun Temple, as subtle background ambience, but without getting in the way of the game, which is what minimal orchestral is all about. So when you open the asset for the first time, you'll see the tracks organized into folders. And then inside each folder, you'll notice that the names of each composition are followed by type and style notes. And what these are there for is to make it a bit easier for you to work out how to use each track in your game. So for example, full and loop, ambient, main, melodic, so on. Generally a full piece of music is the entire composition with a musical ending, so it resolves on a chord or it fades out. It is a standalone piece of music, and typically these are designed to be used in isolation, so to play it once, whereas a loop, in contrast, has the end of the composition, so the effect tails and any reverb that would ring out past the end of the piece of music carried over to the start, and it's cut in musical time to create a seamless loop that will go on and on and on. Just about every track in minimal orchestral has a full and a loop edit. There are a few exceptions where you'll find loopable. Loopable simply means it is a full track. However, because the end of the track naturally occurs on a pause or a silence, it is cut in musical time like a loop, so it can be used in either way. The style notes, such as ambient, melodic, basically give you an idea of how it's going to sound compared to the main composition. So where alternative styles are available, the main version is the original. It's the most developed version of that piece of music, and then an ambient version of that piece would favor longer chords, longer phrases, basically a softer, more distant, larger piece of music, and usually, but not always, would be more suited to a grander scene. Whereas the melodic version of the same piece of music would focus more on the melodic elements and will be a smaller instrumentation, so it will bring the sound of the piece of music in closer. So I'll give you an example of that. So Tundra has versions of all of these, so I'll play the main version and I'll skip to a developed part of it. So now that same piece of music in the ambient edit. And finally, the melodic version. So what these notes are designed to do is just make it a little easier to find a cue that's going to fit well in the scene in your game, which is what I'm going to do now. So what I want to do with this scene, which is essentially just an empty environment with a player running around it, is give it some background music that's kind of mysterious, kind of ever so slightly eerie, but that it doesn't get repetitive and it doesn't feel like it's in the way. So here's how I'm going to do that. I've already added a music object and I've added a script to it. And all this script does basically is at the start of the scene, it waits for 20 seconds, then plays a piece of music, waits for another 10 seconds after that, plays another piece of music. And it will keep doing that over and over for as long as I add pieces of music to it, or looping round and round. And I'm going to use this to create a continuous, subtle ambience in this scene using 2 tracks from Minimal Orchestral, so just 2. So in Minimal Orchestral, I've got a number of folders. So I've got Ancient, so these are historically themed, they're well matched to this type of environment. Frozen Worlds, which is music for mountains, tundras, that kind of feel. Anything that kind of feels big and majestic but a bit hostile, there's going to be something in Frozen Worlds for that. Night Ambience is very subtle, almost synth-like, for basically being outside at nighttime. Open Landscapes is one of the bigger folders in that it has kind of general exploring ambiences, and these are specifically for large open areas. Settlements has a few tracks for very peaceful kind of homely villages, that kind of thing. Underground, this is basically a dungeons folder. It's got dark ambiences, some catacomb type things, crypt music. Basically everything in here kind of sounds dangerous and a little bit dark. And then finally Woodlands, which is kind of a mix between eerie and peaceful tracks. It's aimed at outdoors but without the scale of an open landscape. So this is kind of an ancient old world type environment. So I'm going to start in the Ancient folder. So I'm going to start with Ancient Ambience. So I like Ancient Ambience. It's got a really nice live recorded bass flute performance in it that I really love the sound of. However, it kind of works for busier environments, and given that the player in here is completely on their own, it might be a bit busy. So I'm going to try Ancient City instead. Now, what I like about this track is that it has small details that kind of rise to the surface, they rise above the noise floor of everything else that's going on in the game. And that's kind of what I want here. I kind of want the music to just sit back, to be almost unnoticeable, and then just poke through with small details, little things that you'll just hear as you're moving around. Right, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to drag it onto my object. Right, so I want another track to go with it. And I would like a similarly sparse track. So something that is a bit mysterious and that just has those small details that poke above. So I'm going to try in the Woodlands folder because I know that there's kind of eerie, mysterious stuff in there. So I'm going to start with Endless Forest. And I like that, but I feel like the composition for what I'm doing here is it's a bit thick. So I want something with less density and more details. So I'm going to try Forest Glade instead. and already I can see from the waveform, I know that these peaks are going to crest above whatever sort of noise floor is in the game, so I think this will be more suitable. Right, I'm going to use that. So I'm going to drag that onto my other clip. So in both cases here I'm using the full versions, because what I want is I want an isolated piece of music, importantly separated by a block of silence on either end, and that's what's going to give this a sort of drawn out ambience, as opposed to a track that just loops and loops. No matter how long it is, it would be constant. This is going to feel like it comes and goes, is there and isn't, and kind of give a much more subtle feel of music in this place. Okay, so I've got my two tracks, and now I'm going to set the volume. All of the tracks in Minimal Orchestral are mastered to a peak of around -4 dB, with a dynamic range around somewhere around 15 dB. So the dynamic range being the distance between the average loudness and the peaks. And this is so that the music can sit under other sounds, but its details can still cut through. What it does mean is that when using these tracks, you'll likely want to bring the volume right down, probably more than you expect to need to. In this case, I've got the volume at -10 dB. To put that into perspective, if you were setting the volume directly on the audio source, to get the same volume level, you'd have to set it to around 0.3, where the normal is 1. So it's about a third of the total volume of the music. Now, your mileage may vary, your game's going to be different. This is a particularly quiet scene. However, to get best results from these tracks, it's likely that you're going to want to bring them way down and then slowly bring them up again until they just sit behind other sounds. What is helpful is that all of the tracks are mastered to a consistent peak, so the perceived loudness of all of the tracks is consistent across the entire collection. So even though, for example, here I'm playing two audio clips through the same audio source, I don't have to worry that they're going to sound vastly different, because I know that their peaks and their dynamic range are very similar. They're going to sound as loud as each other. So let's hear how this sounds.